Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the OFL Pensions webinar. The webinar that we are dubbing Bargaining in a Pension Surplus Environment. We're just waiting for a few folks to log on with us here, so just bear with us as we allow people into the room. Thank you.
Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few technical notes. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for a question and answer with the speakers today. So in order to submit a question during the webinar, just locate the Q&A icon. It looks like a question mark in a speech bubble, and it's typically located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So click that icon and type your question into the text box and then click the send button. So today's webinar will also be recorded and will be posted on the OFL's website, and the slide deck will also be shared at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Now I'd like to welcome Ahmed Gaid, the OFL's Secretary Treasurer, for a few welcoming remarks.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ahmed Gaid. I'm the Secretary Treasurer here at the Ontario Federation of Labour. I'm joined by my comrade Venusia Perenenden, the OFL's Interim Director of Research and Education. And on behalf of the Ontario Federation of Labour, I'm delighted to welcome you all today to our webinar that we are dubbing Bargaining in a Surplus Environment. This webinar is brought to you on behalf of our wonderful OFL's Pensions Committee. We're glad that each of you could join us here today during the lunch hour. And whether you're joining us from the public sector, private sector, or the labor movement in general, your presence here today reflects a commitment to be informed in these changing economic conditions. Bargaining dynamics can shift significantly when we're operating in a surplus environment. While on the surface, a surplus might seem like a straightforward advantage, it also introduces new challenges, complexities, and expectations at the bargaining table. Today, we aim to unpack all of those realities together. We'll be hearing from some very experienced negotiators and subject matter experts who will share practical insights and tools that you can take back to your workplaces and to your unions. We encourage you to ask questions during the session. This webinar is part of our ongoing effort to support and empower you all with timely, relevant, and actionable knowledge. Thank you for making the time to be here with us today, and thank you for all the work that you do each and every single day in your roles in this labor movement. So let's get started. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. We are coming here today from our homes and in our workplaces all across Ontario. In honoring the ability to gather, we recognize the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who have inhabited and cared for this land for many millennia. We are broadcasting here from Toronto. As settlers on the ancestral territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, I have learned that this territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. Wherever you live on Turtle Island, we are all treaty people who give gratitude to Indigenous people for their wisdom and their strength in how we look at each other and take care of the land. Part of each of our reconciliation efforts compels us to know and understand Canada's colonialist history, the devastating destruction it has caused, and ways it continues to impact the lives of the first people of this land. As labor leaders in our respective communities and activists in our respective communities who are advocating for workers' rights, we must take particular care to ensure that we are advocating for the rights, health, and safety of Indigenous communities. I encourage you to share the land that you are joining from in the chat. If you do not know exactly where you're joining from, you can find more information at native-land.ca. Again, that's native-land.ca. I'll also be sharing, before we begin, with our first speaker on the pensions webinar, I'd like to review our equity and safer space statement. The OFL, the Ontario Federation of Labour, is committed to providing an inclusive, positive environment at all Federation activities and ensuring that all individuals are treated with respect and dignity. We will not tolerate hateful messages from attendees that are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, or ableist, nor any language that is discriminatory or violent in its intent. As such, we reserve the right to expel any attendees from our event that contribute to this type of behavior, and every instance will be investigated. The OFL's policies and practices must reflect our collective commitment to equality. Our work must demonstrate that all persons deserve dignity, equality, and respect. Now, as we move on, it's my pleasure to introduce James Harnham, one of our panelists here today. James is a partner at Koski Minsky that practices pensions and benefits law. James sits as an advisor on the OFL's pensions committee and provides counsel to unions, employees, and boards of trustees on all aspects of pensions and benefits, administration, and litigation. James, why don't you kick us off today with a bit of a legal disclaimer?
Thanks very much, and thanks to the OFL for putting this together, and thanks for all the attendees for showing up. It's an important issue. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different issues that impact on surplus and bargaining. The nature of the surplus question, from a legal standpoint at least, is such that it's going to be very difficult to be providing any kind of individualized advice on anything here. So just to be very clear, this is a legal education, actuarial education, bargaining education session. It is not a session where we will be giving legal advice. To the extent that legal issues arise as a result of this, certainly the members of the panel are happy to talk about issues offline, but we would encourage you, to the extent that legal issues come up, to speak to your own counsel about how those issues impact your specific situation. Thanks very much, Amit.
And thank you, James. I'd also like to introduce Bhupinder, who will be helping us to administer some of our poll questions here today. Bhupinder Sangera is a trailblazing labor leader and is the first South Asian woman to direct Workers United Canada Council. With over 40 years of experience, she has organized across multiple industries and championed equity through initiatives for women's activities and racialized workers, advancing justice in the Canadian labor movement. She is a trustee chair for a multi-employer benefit plan and pensions plan. Bhupinder, welcome.
Thank you, Ahmed. Hello, everyone. On your screen, you will see a few poll questions pop up right now. Please respond when they appear, as your input helps shape the conversation today. I will also read out the questions being asked. Our panelists would like to know, what type of pension plan do you have at work? Whether you work in the public or private sector, how big your pension plan is, and what role does your union play in your pension plan? Thank you for your input. Ahmed.
Thank you very much. So we've launched the poll questions here for you. Thank you for taking us through that. So we'll have folks just answer that and just give you a moment to do that. And we'll close that off in just a moment when I'm given the signal. And I'll just look for a signal to see if we've had respondents. And we're going to close it off in 3. Okay, so we're just waiting for a few more people to respond. We'll close it off in just a couple seconds here. Okay, thank you very much. 3, 2, 1, we've closed it off. So thank you for that, and that'll provide some input for our panelists to be able to see who's joining us here today. And I want to thank you, Bhupinder. I'd like to now introduce Mark, another one of our panelists here today. Mark Jensen is a senior pensions officer with Canada's largest union, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Mark assists CUPE bargaining units across the country during pensions negotiations and advises CUPE on pension policy, debates regarding both public and workplace pension plans. Mark has previously worked on pensions as a staff representative for several unions and in the office of the leader of the official opposition on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Thank you for joining us here today. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, and thanks to the OFL for putting this on. And as James said, thank you to all of you for coming today. We wanted to ask these poll questions off the top just to get a flavor for who's here with us today. I'm sure you're all connected to the world of pensions. You all know how wide and varied that world is. So just, this was really helpful for us to get a sense of who's here. I'll just kind of walk through some of the answers. What type of pension plan do you have at work? Vast majority of you have a defined benefit plan here today, 74%. We've got 5% with DC, defined contribution plans, 8% with a multi-employer pension plan, and a few who have other or not sure. Fairly even split between public and private sector, slightly more public sector, 54 to 37, a few not sure there. In terms of how big these plans are, as we know in Canada, we've got some very small pension plans. We have some enormous pension plans in the country, and it looks like we're covering the gamut here. We've got 24%, about a quarter of you in very large pension plans in the tens or hundreds of billions, 12% in the single-digit billions, about a third of you in the millions, and about a third not sure. That's fine. And then in terms of what role your unions play in the pension plan, again, this could be more than one role. We've got 16% making appointments to an advisory committee, 35% making appointments to a trustee body, 42% doing some kind of collective bargaining over the plan, 32% appointing to some kind of joint sponsor body, CETA, and a handful who aren't sure. So that was very helpful for us to know who's here, for all of you to know who's here. And as expected, it really does kind of cover the range of the wide diversity of pensions in the country. So I'll move on here. Again, thanks for coming. So the purpose today, really, this webinar was the idea of the OFL Pensions Committee. The committee wanted to do this for a number of reasons, really to recognize that the economic environment for pension plans has really changed over the last few years, and talk about broadly what that means for pension plans and pension bargaining. So the economic environment is always very important for the world of pensions, to both the finances of pension plans and to the politics of pension plans and pension bargaining. The pension bargaining climate is always shaped in some ways by what's happening in the economy. And the committee's been talking about this for a while. We wanted to recognize that many important drivers of what is important to pension plans have really changed in the economic environment since COVID. And we wanted to discuss that here today and what it means for all of us. So a really important driver for pension plans is what's happening to interest rates and bond yields. They are both up significantly in the past few years. We probably all know this from reading stories about interest rates going up for mortgages. Generally, what's bad for our mortgages is actually good news for our pension plans. So the period between 2008 and the financial crisis of 2008 and COVID was really a historically low period for interest rates. And when I say historically, I mean like recorded history. Extremely, extremely low interest rates. They've been falling for decades, but they really, really cratered out after the financial crisis, and particularly right after COVID. Since then, they've been ticking up fairly sharply and holding steady for the last few years. They're essentially at the highest levels they've been at since 2011. And that really does make a big difference for our world of pension plans. We also know that before the last few months, market returns have been pretty good in recent years. Generally, since the financial crisis, we are seeing kind of on average above expected rates of return for our funds, which is more good news. Of course, we've all seen the uncertainties in the markets in the last few months. A good and helpful reminder that uncertainty always is going to exist in our world. And we just need to be aware of that and do our very best to manage it. But the purpose of doing this webinar was really to recognize that the environment has fundamentally shifted from what it was post-financial crisis, and we wanted to talk through what does that mean for unions, what does that mean for pension bargaining. You may have seen the headlines that report pension plan surpluses have reached record levels in the last few years. That's driven by things like these interest rates going up. It's driven by those years of pretty steady and good financial returns. And we also had a change in tax rules that allowed pension plans to accumulate more surplus. So pension plans now are generally much better positioned, sitting with much healthier surpluses than they were before the 2008 financial crisis. It's not every pension plan's in that boat, as we said. This is a very wide and varied field, but generally plans are doing quite well and sitting on surpluses, sometimes very significant surpluses. So that's why the committee wanted to do this. We thought, you know, we talked for so many years about deficits and the challenges that those arose. We talked for years about low interest rates and the challenges those posed for pension plans. We wanted to recognize that that channel or that discussion looks different now than it did in the last few years. And we also want to recognize surpluses in a pension plan really can serve multiple purposes. There's different things that can be done with surpluses, different ways they can be used or not used. And we wanted to essentially give you an introduction for how to think about those issues with respect to your own plan. Again, as James said, the answers will be different depending plan by plan, union by union, priority by priority. But we just wanted to, I guess, give you some things to get those discussions rolling if they're not already. So before I turn to Nevio to walk us through some of the actuarial sides of this, just again, to refresh on a bit of recent history, I think this is very important. Between 2008 and COVID, interest rates were falling and low, historically low. They're now turned around. When this was happening, when these rates were falling, we saw governments and employers essentially making the argument that the defined benefit model was broken or no longer worked or was structurally unsustainable. And what the key rationale they used for this argument was the fact that interest rates were low. Here we have the government of Canada making this argument when they were contemplating target benefit legislation at the federal level. And here we have the government of New Brunswick making the same argument as they overhauled their pension system, interest rates at the lowest levels in 60 years. So this was a constant refrain from employers and governments saying low interest rates are posing a structural challenge to DB pension plans. Can't help but notice that since those interest rates have been ticking up in recent years, we don't hear very much from the other side about what interest rate increases might mean for pension plans. I think that's our job, and that's why we wanted to get together today to talk about this. So I will now turn to Nevio, who's going to walk us through the actuarial side of pension surpluses.
Thanks, Mark. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. A big thank you to the OFL for inviting me today to join with these two great panelists. My portion of this panel discussion is, as Mark mentioned, to try to tie in surplus with discount rates. I guess to start, the question then becomes, let's have a broad definition of surplus so that we know where we're starting. And it's an easy concept. Surplus is when you have assets that are greater than your liabilities. I guess the difficult part of this all is understanding what liabilities are. And when we speak of a liability, all that really is the value or the total cost to settle the benefits that have been earned up to the valuation date. And the way they're measured, they're done in a variety of different ways for different purposes. But for today's discussion, we're really concerned only with what we call the going concern liabilities. That will be the form of when we determine whether or not they're surplus. It's a reflection of a going concern basis or the fact or the assumption that the plan continues indefinitely over time. There's several important assumptions that go into determining liabilities. And one of them, and maybe perhaps one of the most important, is called the discount rate. There we go. So let's think of a pension plan. And a pension plan is designed, defined benefit pension plan. I want to be clear about this. It's not defined contribution, but a defined benefit pension plan is designed such that you earn a benefit, and at some point in the future, perhaps many, many years out, you start receiving a stream of benefit payments on a monthly basis. Well, we need to know what the value of that stream is today. And that single value today is called the actuarial present value. And determining it relies heavily on the discount rate. So a discount rate, in a very simplistic term, and shown in the form of an example that I've highlighted here, if we think about it, imagine that you owe someone $1,000 in 5 years' time. What do you put away today to be able to pay that promise 5 years later? Well, one option is just to take your $1,000 and put it in a box or under your mattress, and you pull it out 5 years later and you've satisfied your obligation. Of course, there's no investment feature here. There's a 0% return, but you have met your obligation. Alternatively, because you don't have $1,000 today, you find, say, something like a stock, an equity, that pays 8% per year for 5 years. That allows you to put away $681 today and have that 8% develop and earn the additional amount that you need so that you have $1,000 in 5 years to pay your obligation. Actuarially, when we look at this scenario, what we say is that $1,000 discounts to $681 over 5 years at 8%. So simply put, 8% is your discount rate in this example, and your liability is $680. What's really important to take from this quasi-conversation on interest rates is that the lower the interest rate, the higher the liability. And this becomes important when we start talking about how interest rates are going up and down, because that will obviously impact the levels of liability and therefore surplus. So the approach that we took on the discount rate in the prior slide, very simplistic, but it does extend itself to how we do it for pension plans. The most common, not only, but the most common approach is to look at the plan's asset mix as defined, the asset targets as defined in the investment policy, and we apply them to expected long-term returns for each asset class. Broadly speaking, most pension plans have some sort of combination of equities and fixed income. And here's another example. We're just going to assume a 60-40 split of equities and fixed income. And we bring ourselves back to the 80s, where we were experiencing extremely high equity and bond returns. And we were able to develop discount rates on a long-term basis that were well above 9% before we applied any particular margins. A decade later, when we had experienced and continued to experience dropping bond returns, we find that discount rates were pushing just over 7% before margins. And that's a big, big drop over a short period of time. So today we have discount rates that are averaging between 5 and 6% when we're funding pension plans. An important concept, though, on the drop of rates or even in the increase is how that impacts pension plans. A 1% decrease, or really 1% change in discount rate, will adjust liabilities 15 to 18%. So you drop your discount rate 1%, liabilities are shooting up 15 to 18% for an average sized, average maturity level plan. And accrual costs for a same drop would go up 25%. Now, in large part, these funding discount rates that started dropping over time from the 80s are driven by what we call the risk-free rate of return, which is ultimately a look at what the Government of Canada bond yields are returning. The top line is the 1990s yield curve, well above 12 or 10% across the curve. Over time, it's come down and down. And I know that you can't really see it here, but the bottom line, that green line, is 2019, where the yield curve throughout all durations was below 2%. And that created drastic changes in how outlooks were going to be used for developing discount rates, but more importantly, returns in general over time. Today, we're at that light blue bar, sort of at the bottom, hovering around the 3.5%. And as Mark said, we've seen strides and improvements in these bond yields. And as these bond yields have come up over the last 5 years, so have expected returns, and so has the upward or pressure to increase discount rates as needed. But what is it that we can expect going forward? And I'm going to start from the bottom here, that big red statement that there's just too much market noise to truly predict movements of the yields and therefore of discount rates. So, I mean, there's some truths that we know, some economic truths, in that if inflation kicks in again, or if government deficits continue increasing, we're likely to see bond yields on an upward trend. Conversely, if we fall into a recession, we're likely to see them drop again. So that's the way the bonds are going to move. As for discount rates, it's a little trickier. What we would expect right now is that they're likely to remain somewhat stable at current levels. It's really worth noting that as actuaries, when we develop an assumption like a discount rate, we add in a margin or a buffer to reflect the fact that rates are volatile and they can swing up and down, and we're not interested in changing our outlook or our projected discount rate valuation after valuation. So these buffers act to sort of shock absorb some of the things that may happen in the markets. Depending on the level of margin or this buffer that sits into that assumption, it could be that rates will stay stable or maybe change plus or minus 25 basis points. But that's something that's very specific to the assumption being used for that specific pension plan. But as it stands, we're expecting, if any pressure, it's likely to go upward rather than downward, but likely stay status quo. So now let's try to bring this back into a surplus discussion. The 80s, we were faced with staggering surpluses. And in large part, or pretty much all part, we had extremely strong market returns. So you had very strong valuation of assets. And you had very high bond and equity returns, which meant very high discount rates. And going back to what I said earlier, the higher the discount rate, the lower the liability. So you had this beautiful relationship of high asset, low liability, great surplus. But then things started changing. In the mid to late 80s, there was a lot of pension reform, new regulations that were introducing stricter funding requirements centering around solvency valuations. You had falling interest rates or bond yields, as I showed in prior slides, creating a lot of downward pressure on going concern discount rates. So now you're funding your liabilities with lower discount rates, which means larger liability. And then you add to that a lot of the market hits of the 80s, the dot-coms of the early 2000s financial crisis, and it started impacting pension plans negatively. It would ultimately exhaust surplus in a lot of pension plans. But now we're seeing a return to surplus. And how did all that happen? And there wasn't a magic pill. There was likely, for any pension plan, a combination of a variety of factors. But some of them that we see or have seen, I've listed here. And the first is those rigid funding requirements required more cash contributions going into pension plans. And they were going in at robust market growth. That is, there was large bull market periods where those contributions were just being positively impacted by the bull markets. Over the last couple of decades, pension plans have sought out different investment alternatives, primarily private debt, private equity, real estate, infrastructure. And these unique asset classes were able to produce additional added returns without adjusting or increasing the risk profile to pension plans. We saw interest rates starting to creep up, upward pressure meant better returns outlooks and higher discount rates. And in some part, there was a valuation timing aspect. And by that, I'm just going to get to the next slide. When we do a valuation, it's a point-in-time estimate at a particular date. Depending what that date is, there's going to be a different picture to tell. And by that, I mean, if we look at this particular graph, those blue bars are the bull market runs that we've sustained. They're large, they're impactful. And I fully appreciate some of the downturn economic environments that we've had. And you see them in the bottom red bars. And while they've been quite large in terms of pension plan, the losses that have been sustained because of these periods of time, they've been more than offset by the bull market runs that we've had. So depending on your pension plan was actually valued and the funding requirements at that particular date, you could have had, for example, a valuation filed just before the financial crisis that showed lots of surplus because you've just experienced a long bull run. And just a mere few months later, you would have been perhaps in a deficit position. And timing does play an important role in that. And this is why when we speak of surplus, the question of whether or not it's real or it's really there is an important question to have. As an actuary, we prepare a valuation report, and that's a rear view look of the plan up to a specific date. So by the time we finish our valuation reports a few months after the valuation date, we would end up talking to a board of trustees or directors and say, it's now June, but at January 1, you had a surplus. So the question is, can you do anything with that surplus that was there 6 months ago? I mean, is it still there? So the question then becomes, well, how far forward are you really going to drive if you're looking in the rearview mirror? That's a tough question. And that's because you really can't go far. I can assure you that as an actuary, our valuations are as of that date. Decisions being made months, perhaps a year or 2 years later, need something far more updated, a better review than what that report shows. So imagine an actuary, I said, we come and we show that you have 120% funded surplus 6 months ago. Well, I mean, our professional experience has shown two very different mindsets. There's individuals, there's boards that say it's perfect time to run for the exits. We can absolve ourselves of this obligation. We just can't afford it any longer. Then there's the opposite end where they just want to give immediate benefit improvements. Now, these are extreme cases, and there's a lot to do in the middle first. And the truth is, those extreme cases carry a lot of significant risks. So the question is, before any decision is made, there's a lot of consideration to be made. And some of the things that can be made, first and foremost, is having the actuaries do what they're trained to do. And that's look out in the future. Have them model to see, A, is that surplus still here 6 months later? And is it going to be here in 6 months or a year with or without changes that we're looking at? Maybe consider risk mitigation. Buy some annuities for a tranche of benefits, or consider what we call an LDI, where you construct your asset portfolio to match what the plan is expected to pay over time. This way, as liabilities go up, so do your assets, and they move in tandem, completely eliminating or at least minimizing the risk of deficit. Make sure, speak to your other advisors like legal counsel, and make sure that your funding policy has adequate assets, or at least outlines what triggers are going to be used for benefit improvements and what assets are going to be kept aside before improvements are even considered. And as an actuary, I would strongly recommend that valuations be done on an annual basis, even if they're not filed, only because that gives the opportunity to look and assess risks before they actually happen, allowing you an opportunity to deal with it so that you don't have to file in a problematic situation. So I do want to end my discussion portion here by just saying there's a lot to consider for our pension plan, and we still remain in a very volatile environment. So it's really important that you seek the information that you need from all your advisors and take those steps before you make any decisions on how to deal or what to do with any particular surplus. To that,
Thank you very much, Nevio, for your perspectives and for sharing that with us. And just so I can share a little bit about Nevio, Nevio Tenuta is a senior consultant and actuary at Segal with over 26 years of experience in pension plan risk management. He currently provides actuarial advice on multi-employer and staff pension plans for a diverse array of unions throughout much of Canada. And additionally, Nevio has worked on several CCAA proceedings to quantify the employee's loss of benefits and has volunteered with the IFEBP to deliver educational presentations to trustees. So thank you so much for sharing that with us here today, Nevio. That said, I just want to remind folks that have joined us here today as participants to please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and get through as many questions as we can later in the program. But yes, just use the icon located at the bottom of your screen. We'll now turn it over to James Harnum, who's going to walk us through the historical and modern legal approach to pension plan surplus. James?
Thanks very much, Ahmed. So again, noting that this is legal education and not legal advice, going to take you through some high-level considerations about surplus from a legal perspective. So it's interesting to connect the history of surplus ownership and surplus litigation to the creation of pension law as something that was done on the union side, and also something that I think, you know, for a very long time, as I understand, I mean, this was largely before I was born, but for a very long time, pension surplus just kind of sat in plans, and it was something that employers sort of saw as, you know, it's a buffer for future issues and something that they may be able to access. Pension surplus litigation really defined pension law in the 90s for some of the macroeconomic reasons that Nevio pointed out. So if we trace why surplus litigation existed and why it was so prevalent, it's a funny Income Tax Act issue. So in the 50s and 60s, the Income Tax Act required that if you were to set up a pension plan for your employees that would be tax advantageous for you as the employer, you would be required to basically pay that money into the pension in an irrevocable trust. So the Income Tax Act, and at the time the Department of National Revenue, required that amounts paid into pension plans would be irrevocable. So if you pay money into a pension plan and you pay more than you needed, you're going to have surplus arise for the reasons that Nevio has stated. Then in the early 80s, the law switched. And instead of requiring that it be irrevocable, it actually required that pension plans have a provision saying that it could be on wind-up return to the employer. So what that means is that the vast majority of surplus litigation, both then and even until today, largely relates to pre-90 plans that were created before the 80s. So one such plan that was created before the 80s was the Dominion Store Pension Plan. And in some ways, this is really the beginning of, you know, it's one of the principal first fights about surplus. Conrad Black took $37 million from the Dominion Stores Pension Plan. He did it on application to the pension regulator at the time. It was ultimately challenged by a group of unions, and the divisional court ultimately finds that withdrawal was unauthorized. And as part of that determination, the divisional court found that the pension regulator, in assessing the application for surplus, actually owed a fiduciary duty to the plan membership. As a pension lawyer and someone who advises both unions and members, but also advises unionized boards of trustees of pension plans, this decision's a little bit, it's certainly the high watermark of holding a regulator to account for the decisions it makes about members of pension plans. Not 100% sure that it would be exactly the same case would be decided today, but it does highlight one critical aspect of surplus we're going to talk a little bit about here, and that is the regulator is often a really important party to get involved because the regulator has some tools that individual plan members and the unions maybe don't have. Okay, so that was Collins. The next major pension case that I'll talk about is Schmidt and Air Products. So this was a Supreme Court of Canada case that came out in the mid-90s. And this really crystallized what we would call the modern approach to pension surplus ownership issues. Prior to this decision, there had been sort of two streams of cases, one coming out of Ontario and one coming out of BC. One took what I would call an equity or trust-based approach to determination of pension surplus, and one took more of a contractual approach. So the BC approach was principally contractual about what the reasonable expectations of the parties were in that contract. The Ontario approach was more trust-based about, well, what does it mean to pay money into a trust fund that is supposed to be there irrevocably? And what does it mean when the employer decides they don't want it to be irrevocable anymore? So start changing the language in their trust agreement, start changing the language in their pension plans. And what Schmidt basically said is that where a pension fund is impressed with a trust, that trust is subject to trust law. So all applicable legal principles about trusts apply to pensions. That was what was said in 1995. That has been softened a little bit. But at the end of the day, what you need to look at when determining surplus ownership is when the employer, when the plan sponsor first created the plan and created the trust fund, did they retain a right to surplus for themselves, or alternatively, did they retain a right to amend that trust arrangement such that they were the ones that might end up with surplus? So in the legal disclaimer, I said, this is not legal advice. These are, there are an infinite number of different arrangements and different historical plan documents differ for every pension plan. And the analysis of who owns surplus, well, I think today we are fairly clear in terms of what that analysis requires. The analysis will be very different for each pension plan. Okay, so just talking a little bit about some of the uses of surplus and how that impacts on the legal questions. So Mark has taken us through some of these already, and Nevio, so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty too much, but so employers like surplus for a variety of reasons. But one is that very early on in the Schmidt case, it was determined that basically if you have surplus in a pension plan and there's nothing that specifically precludes it, the employer is allowed to use surplus to pay contributions owing to the plan. They are in effect allowed to use surplus to take what we call a contribution holiday. That's perfectly allowable. It does not require an explicit authority. Really what it requires is no explicit prohibition. Employers will also sometimes use the surplus in their defined benefit component to pay contributions owing to a defined contribution component. Koski-Minsky litigated this case about 20 years ago about the Hudson's Bay pension plan, where it was determined that the defined benefit component of the Hudson's Bay plan, which could be traced to the Simpson stores, was allowed to be utilized to pay defined contribution amounts owing to Zellers and Kmart employees who were also under the HBC umbrella. What's interesting about that case is it also determined that while HBC was entitled to use surplus to pay contributions for the DC plan, if the HBC plan was ever to be wound up, surplus would be owned by the employees. This is obviously interesting and relevant because the HBC plan has just been transferred to FSRA. There's no order to wind it up yet, but HBC, as a result of its insolvency, no longer owns its pension plan, and FSRA has transferred administration. I'm sorry, I said to FSRA. FSRA has transferred administration to a third-party administrator, TELUS Health, who may ultimately wind up the plan. And it's a plan that has $150 million of surplus in it. So be interesting to see what ends up happening there. So obviously, as Mark and Nevio both discussed, the use of surplus can be used for benefit improvements. In an ongoing pension plan, it can be difficult for employees to get at surplus prior to wind up. What the case law basically says is that an employee's interest with respect to surplus during the life of an ongoing plan, that employee's interest, the member's interest, is largely procedural. There has to be procedures in place so that surplus is not taken out inappropriately, as it had been in the Dominion Stores case. But what employees are not able to do is, in an ongoing plan, force the extraction of surplus. There's some case law on that we could do a whole weekend conference on, so I won't go too much in depth about it here. But the considerations with surplus are very different in an ongoing plan than they are once winding up occurs. So back in the 90s, in the heyday of surplus litigation, there was a real legislative vacuum about the process for how you would share surplus and how an employer would show that they were entitled to surplus. That led to many years of a surplus sharing regulation that FSRA had, the pension regulator, which ultimately transitioned into a full legislative scheme as of 2011 that allows employers and employee groups, unions, members, to come to an agreement about how surplus will be shared. This can happen both on wind up and in an ongoing plan. And to the extent that there is an employer with big surplus in its fund that wants to get it out, the easiest route for that employer at any given time is to come to a surplus sharing arrangement. So your members may very well be approached because at the end of the day, the employer needs to get buy-in from the members. There's actually a vote about whether or not that surplus sharing agreement will go ahead. In an ongoing plan, it is actually possible to distribute cash to employees where there's surplus. Without a surplus sharing agreement, you would do that through a plan amendment. I personally have never seen an employer amend their plan to pay cash out to employees in surplus, but it is actually possible. Okay, final slide. We've talked a lot about this already, but the one thing that I'll point out here is where you are engaging with an employer about surplus, it is really critical that you have information. And you have rights as a trade union. Members have the rights, but trade unions themselves have rights under the Pension Benefits Act to request all historical plan documentation. So when you want to engage with an employer about surplus, you want to know who owns that surplus. In order to know who owns that surplus, you have to engage in that historical documentation analysis. You can get it from the employer, but you can also get it from FSRA. And I have had experiences where we have done a document request on behalf of a trade union to an employer and done the same document request to FSRA. And lo and behold, the historical plan documents that said the employees owned the surplus were not given to us by the employer. They were only given to us by FSRA. So the employer went back to like 1985 and said, look, that's all we have left. Can't find anything else. And FSRA gave us going all the way back to the 40s, which clearly stated that the employees, upon the creation of the trust, own the surplus. So really critical to use those information structures to get what you need, and don't always rely on the employer, although I expect with the group here, you already know to not always listen to what the employer tells you. The final thing I'll just add is that there are some things you can do with collective agreement language to protect surplus, but remember that surplus lasts sometimes 20, 30, 50 years, and your collective agreement might only last 3. And so I've got a client right now with some nice language about surplus in their collective agreement. That collective agreement is expiring, and FSRA is trying to transfer assets out of the plan. Or not FSRA, I'm sorry, the employer is trying to transfer assets out of the plan. Once that's done, that collective agreement language won't protect them. So lots to think about. Not a lot of answers that we can give you today, but hopefully there are things that people start to think about as it looks like this surplus climate is likely here to stay for at least some time. Those are my remarks. Thank you, Amit.
And thank you, James. We really appreciate your insights in providing us in some of those examples as well, and giving us a bit of a historical context there. Just as a reminder to our attendees, please submit any burning questions you might have in the question and answer feature. The icon's located at the bottom of your screen. Just click it and ask your question in there, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. I know we're running out of time here, but we commit to trying to get through as many questions as we can. Next up, I want to invite Mark to share the union's perspective on this very important issue. Mark, over to you.
Thanks. I'll wrap this up quickly so we have time for questions. We've talked a lot about all this already. Employers aren't going to bring this issue up. Employers aren't going to be the ones asking us to think more about surpluses. That's going to be our issue. So we're going to have to do a couple things. I think it would be a good practice for you to all understand, does your plan have a surplus? How to find that out? And then how to really understand what the surplus is. As Nevio said earlier, surpluses is not as simple as the amount that's reported as a funded ratio. There can be margins buried within a pension plan and actuarial assumptions. You really need to take a bit of a deeper dive to understand how much surplus is actually within your plan. As James just said, get your plan documents to understand who owns surplus legally within your plan. As we just heard, that can be an undertaking in and of itself, but it's a good thing to spend some time to understand. And then once you have all that information, you can really think about, is the surplus benefiting our members? Is our surplus strategy, whatever it may be, benefiting our members? Could it benefit our members more if we took things in a slightly different direction? As we said, there's many different things you can do with surpluses. You can have a reserve there. You can fund a benefit improvement. There can be contribution holidays. Of course, we would approach all those differently. And I guess just encouraging you to think about what balance of all those things is right for your pension plan and the best for your members. So that's the end. That leaves us a couple of minutes for questions on that.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for that, Mark. So we're nearing the end of our webinar here, this lunch and learn, if you will. We have a few questions that have been coming in, but perhaps I'll kick things off by asking a few of them, and then I'll kick it over to Venusia to ask us the balance. This question, it's for either of you. Is there ever a time in which the employer has the right to the surplus over the workers?
Yeah, absolutely. So there definitely is. And employers are pretty careful to draft their documents in a way that gives it to them. I think that the key thing to think about here is, if you have a pension plan text, right? You have your current pension plan text, and it says the employer owns the surplus, as virtually all modern pension plan texts will say. That's not the end of the analysis. Right? What they've said in their current pension plan text, that doesn't necessarily mean the employer owns the surplus. You need to do this historical review. And the fact is, most pensions before 1980 will have been created with an irrevocable trust for employees. Most pensions that were created after 1980 will not have been created with an irrevocable trust. So employers are able to bring an application to court or to FSRA to determine that an amount is purely theirs. Procedural fairness would require that unions and members be given notice of that. There's also some legislative requirements, but at the end of the day, absolutely, there are arguments that employers will make that they are 100% entitled to the surplus. From a legal standpoint, there will be situations where they are.
Thank you so much for that, James. Again, next question, it's up for grabs by any of our panelists here. What protections can members push for to ensure surpluses are reinvested into benefits or future security rather than simply employer savings?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think really you'd want to start with the steps that we've sort of laid out today, getting the plan documents, getting a crystal clear understanding of the current status of surplus. That's a legal exercise, having an actuarial look at things as well for the points Nevio covered today. And then there will be certain questions that are strategic for the union that have no one right answer. Just what balance do you want to strike between reserves versus benefit improvements? There's no right answer to that question. It really is a question about what are your priorities and how you balance these different potential uses of surplus. So I would say get the documents, understand the status quo, and then do some serious thinking about could it be improved for your members. I think that's a good start. Nevio, James, I don't know if you have more to add.
No, I think that's right. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these questions aren't legal. These are bargaining questions. They're political questions. They're power questions. And so there may be rounds where the employer really needs something out of you. And one thing to be thinking about is putting safeguards around your pension plan. It can be about surplus, but it can also just be about not allowing them to amend it to take away future, benefit accruals, changing future benefit accruals. I think that every trade union should be thinking very carefully about the agreements that they make about pensions, because one thing that I've noticed as a pension lawyer who, principally works for trade unions, sometimes there are decisions that are made at the bargaining table that look like, that they make sense to both sides, but there can sometimes be unintended consequences on pension plans and on pension funding and on the ability of employers to unilaterally change those pensions later. So definitely highly recommend where you're bargaining pension language that you get some advice.
I'll tack one other thought onto this. We're kind of speaking about this in an employer versus union kind of traditional bargaining approach. Of course, we have a number of very large jointly sponsored pension plans in the country where it's not really traditional pension bargaining. There are pension boards set up where different negotiations and discussions happen. It's been at some of those tables that we've seen some real significant benefit improvements out of surplus in recent years. The Healthcare of Ontario pension plan has done some very significant retroactive benefit improvements for accrued benefits, like 30% increases to members, like very significant increases. And we've seen the same in our healthcare plan in Nova Scotia as well. Very significant round of benefit improvements for members funded out of surplus. So again, this is not, we're not only talking about this from a single employer traditional bargaining perspective. These issues also are debated at whatever decision-making practices are in effect at some of the biggest plans in the country.
Thank you very much for that. I know we touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can restate where we would find the specific provisions around surplus use and ownership of our plan. And are there any disclosure obligations we should know about?
Yeah, so in terms of where you'll find the specific provisions about surplus ownership, they don't exist. So one of the interesting choices that the legislatures around the country have made is to not wade in to the difficult policy question of who should own surplus. So principally what the legislative regime has been across the country is a regime about process. And at the end of the day, the law on who owns surplus still tracks back to that 1995 Supreme Court of Canada case in Schmidt. There are, I think, political difficulties in a democracy in terms of deciding which side owns surplus as simply a matter of policy. And they haven't. I mean, you'll see a lot of difficulty in legislatures trying to determine who owns something like surplus in the pension context, because people are afraid. In my view, politicians are afraid of wading into this issue because no matter what side you go on, you're going to piss somebody off a lot. So despite urging by the judiciary in the Schmidt case and in later cases, there is no legislative pronouncement on who owns surplus. Instead, there is some judge-made law from the 90s and a procedure in legislation around the country about how you determine how that judge-made law applies. But there is no clear legislative pronouncement on who owns surplus. In terms of the disclosure stuff, I mean, we talked about that earlier. FSRA and the employer both have obligations to provide pension information when requested. I believe every jurisdiction has a rule somewhat like this, although I will point out, because I like to point out the problems with OSFI when possible. So OSFI is the federal pension regulator, and the federal pension law has the same requirement that you can either ask the employer or you can ask the regulator. And for the reason I gave earlier, sometimes you want to ask the regulator and the employer. But OSFI's position is, despite the fact that they are required to give you this information, they prefer that you ask the employer, and any questions to OSFI will be directed to the employer. So you can imagine some challenges there if you are, say, investigating a pension class action and you have members who don't want to be asking their employer for all their pension plan documents because they're currently actively working. So in my view, OSFI really should be doing that, but they're not. I have less experience with other jurisdictions.
Thank you, James. We also have a question from one of our attendees. Do we know what the impact of higher interest rates is on investment returns for DC plans on average? Presumably positive, but significantly positive? Question.
Sure, I'll jump on that one. When we talk about DC plans, there's different investment platforms that are offered to participants to invest in. With respect to rising interest rates, generally speaking, one way of thinking of how you're going to return money is that you start with your risk-free rate, and then there's what we call a risk premium attached to that. That is, if I'm going to invest in the government of Canada and get 4% over 10 years, if I have to give my money to someone else on a risky basis like a stock, there should be a premium. So the whole concept is, if that risk-free rate is increasing, it should increase pressure for overall returns to go up as well, because the risk premium generally stays fixed. With rising interest rates, we would expect higher returns. That's not necessarily true because that's quite dynamic and it depends on the product itself and what we're talking about in terms of the investment product. But generally speaking, increasing bond yields, Government of Canada bond yields or treasury yields, would put upward pressure on investment returns as well. And that's why discount rates would have the opportunity to perhaps increase, because the overall outlook is increasing.
Thank you, Nevio. We also have another question from one of the attendees. In the previous period of low interest rates and chronic deficits, governments explored introducing DB plans solvency reserve accounts to encourage sponsors to make solvency deficiency special payments that sponsors could recover later when the plan reported surpluses. Do SRAs have any relevance today? In any Canadian jurisdiction, did DB plan sponsors make use of SRAs in ways that affect control over today's pension surpluses? And do SRAs have any significance for the future if DB plans continue to be in surplus?
So maybe I can start. So solvency reserve accounts were something that people were really pushing in the sort of, 2010 to 2020 period, because from a policy standpoint, the employer's concern was, look, you're making me pay these huge special payments into the plan, but we are in a climate that may change in 10 years. So the concern was they're paying all this money into the pension plan. And for some of the reasons we've talked about today, the employer accessing money in the plan once it's in there is very challenging. So solvency reserve accounts were posited as a solution here. You would allow an employer to basically pay money into a specific account that they would have a better ability to reclaim from later on. It is not an approach that Ontario has followed. To my knowledge, both British Columbia and Alberta have followed that approach. I have not had any personal experience with their use, but the basic premise is you pay money in. Once you get over a certain threshold of funding, you have the ability to withdraw those funds. I don't know if Mark or Nevio has had any more experience with them, but my understanding is it's only Alberta and BC at this point.
Yeah, I haven't had any experience with them either, and solvency has always been a major issue, and I think governments or jurisdictions have found creative ways to try to deal with that, and they've come full circle in many ways. But I haven't used them, but I to James' point, they made sense for the time. I'm not sure if they truly make sense today with changes in pension legislation and funding.
Yeah, I believe
and,
they only matter once you start making solvency special payments, and the fact is not many people are making those payments now. So even if they're on the books in a couple provinces, I doubt they're triggered at all yet.
Yeah, and in Ontario, and I believe in some other jurisdictions a few years ago, they changed the funding requirement for DB plans on solvency. So it's only once you dip under 85% on a solvency ratio that you have to make payments. So that legislative change is the same. It's responding to the same problem.
Thank you, James. There's another question here for Mark specifically to clarify. Has there been any decision regarding the New Brunswick retirees who had their DB plan changed into a target pension plan by the union without consent of the retirees?
Yeah, I can answer that. There was legislation passed, as was mentioned, to force a conversion of these DB plans into target benefit plans. That their new Liberal government has introduced a bill to reverse that law. It's yet to be passed, but it's had first reading.
Yeah, but I actually think that this question might be about the 2013 change. So I think he's asking about the New Brunswick retirees who had their traditional DB plan changed into a target benefit plan. So there was a constitutional challenge brought to that by PIPS, which CUPE has intervened in, and I can tell you it is still being litigated.
Thank you. And another question is, should we be concerned where our pension funds are invested due to tariffs and unstable stock markets? How do we put pressure to ensure where funds are invested in equitable and Canadian markets?
I know I have a few comments to make, James. I'm not sure, or Mark, but that's a very difficult answer. And by that, I think we have to think principally about what a pension plan arrangement is. And it is a long-term arrangement. It's not to suggest that certain things like tariffs or whatever it is wouldn't impact us or a pension plan per se, but pension plans don't want to immediately they're not little speedboats. They're not there to change direction immediately. They're like tankers. They have to move slowly and thoughtfully. So when it comes to a particular investment change, well, first thing, it's got to be dictated by the investment policy. Trustees and boards of directors have to consider what's allowable under the pretense of their own policies. And then they have to consider what investments make sense for the plan itself with relation to the demographics and the benefits that are going to be provided. So the answer is not that quick. And the truth is, I'll use continue with the tariff example. It's on and off and on and off, and don't know where it's going to go with the tariffs. So pension plans just can't react to something like that without a full scope understanding of where it's going to really be. Should they be concerned? Well, that really comes down to the board's perception and the investment policy itself on how they feel it's going to impact the plan, because as fiduciaries, they have to be concerned about the plan first and foremost. But James, I'm sure you may have a different view or an added view to that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I have a different view. I mean, I think that the difficulty with tariffs are we just don't know what's going to happen. But I did want to make a brief comment about the final part of that question, which was, how do we make sure that they're invested in equitable Canadian markets? So I think there's a very different question about whether you're a member in a union dealing with a single employer or whether you are dealing with a JSPP where the union may have, seats at the sponsor table. They may be appointing people to the administrative board. In those cases, there may be some real work that a trade union can do in terms of, trying its best to hold the board of trustees to account for the investment choices they make. However, I will point out that there is a difficulty in Canadian law that I like to remind people of whenever I can, because I don't think people realize this. But the fact is, even if you had a board that was made up entirely of union representatives who had a united view that investing just in Canada was what they wanted to do today, investment rules wouldn't allow that, right? So you are a prudent person. You're held as a pension plan administrator. You're held to the prudent investor standard. When you are making decisions about the pension plan, your principal, in fact, really your only concern has to be an economic one, where you are utilizing questions of environmentalism, social governance factors, ESG factors, as we call them. What the law will tell you today is, as a pension fiduciary, you are required to think about those things, but you are not allowed to think about them for the purposes of what we would call collateral benefit investing. Instead, those are inputs that you must think about when you think about risk-adjusted rate of return. So it makes a lot of sense to not put all the pension plan's money into fossil fuels when we're transitioning to a green economy. But your rationale for those investments has to be one that's based on risk-adjusted rate of return for the pension plan, as opposed to social benefit, environmental benefit. And I just like to point out to people that that's a legal requirement. That's a choice that has been made. There's nothing natural about it. There's no requirement that is the way it is, but in Canadian pension law, it is, which leads to some difficulties when you have a board of trustees who may very well want to use the assets in their pension fund to, to do some form of collateral benefit investing. So how do you ensure that they're invested in equitable Canadian markets? It's really, really difficult. Really, really difficult. Leanne McMillan is pointing out that where your trust agreement sets up the ability to do things like this, it is more possible. That's absolutely the case. But it is a challenging issue and not something that you can simply say, we're the board of trustees, this is what we want to do. Your hands can be very tied in the Canadian pension climate.
Thank you, James. And we have a couple more questions before we end the webinar. Can you discuss the obligations the current union bargaining are for the retirees in a non-wind-up situation? Payout to existing members who may not have contributed to the surplus, sometimes called intergenerational equity?
No, we can't. It's really that. Yeah, sorry, Mark, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question. We don't track individual accounts, so I've come across this question a number of times. It's one of these things that there's no good and simple answer for. Your obligation is to treat, as a trustee, is to treat plan members fairly, not just one group or the other, and you have to actually be even-handed between them. If it's trustees making that decision, if it's sponsors, it's a different discussion. There's no simple answer. I would, again, just default back to what I said earlier about get the facts, get all your advice you need, think through all of this carefully and fairly.
And back to Ahmed for one last question.
Thank you very much. So I'll ask our last question. Perhaps this is like a fire round, 30 seconds or less from maybe one or even all the panelists. I appreciate our panelists sticking around and our attendees and our participants for sticking around. We went a little over time, but again, this is really part of our commitment in terms of learning about pensions and learning about surpluses in pensions. So our final question. Are there any other resources that you can share that would help support unions to bargain our pension surpluses fairly during negotiations? And a part B of that question is surpluses, spend it or save it. So who wants to kick us off?
I can start. I'll just say what I said earlier again in terms of strategy. Just understand the status quo. That is probably more complicated than it sounds. It probably will take some legal and actuarial work on the part of the union to understand where things are now, and to understand your options, and then just do a big think on the strategy around surplus. And on the last question, right or wrong, spend or save. Again, there's no correct answer. You got to do all that work and think about your own circumstances. But the question is an important question.
I'm just going to adopt Mark's answer because that's what I would have said too.
Okay, awesome.
I'll just answer this spend it or save it. As I tell most of my clients in this environment, you don't want to spend what you have to take back in a year or two. So you know, there's nothing wrong with benefit improvements, but I think this is where your funding policy comes into play, and your analysis with your advisors. See what you can do and make sure you can sustain it. And if you can sustain it, you spend it. But again, that's always up to the tolerance of the trustees, but you can do both. Surprisingly, you can do both in one action.
Thank you very much to all of you, to all of our panelists. I know you stuck around a little bit longer than we anticipated to answer these questions, but a lot of good questions coming in from our attendees. So thank you for sharing your insights on all of this. And we want to thank all of our attendees for being here. But before we end off, I just want to give a special thanks. One, obviously, to our attendees, to James, to Mark, to Nevio. Thank you so much. To all the folks that were involved with this webinar. Thank you, Bhupinder, for helping us out. Huge thanks to our staff here. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Cassandra. And a special thank you to Venusia for bringing this all together. There's a lot of work that happens on the back end of this, and we really appreciate the OFL staff in helping to pull this all together. If you're interested in more events like these, our ability to come together and learn together from experts, we're going to be sending out a poll question to your emails that you signed up to this webinar with. We'll be sending you that poll question. We're asking you to respond to it so that you can suggest other topics related to pensions that you want to hear more about. So please take that opportunity when you get the email to respond and give us a bit of feedback. And perhaps we can look forward to other modules just like this one in the very near future. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you to our panelists, thank you to the staff, and thank you to our attendees. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.